March 28, 1900. A British colonial governor stands before a gathering of African chiefs in the Golden Palace of Kumasi, Ghana. His name is Frederick Hodgson, and what comes out of his mouth next will trigger the bloodiest war in British African colonial history. "Where is the Golden Stool?" Hodgson demands, his voice echoing through the ancient hall. "Why am I not sitting on the Golden Stool at this moment? I am the representative of the paramount power in this country." The African chiefs sit in stunned silence. What Hodgson doesn't understand is that he's just committed the equivalent of marching into the Vatican and demanding to defecate on the Pope's throne. The Golden Stool isn't just furniture. To the Ashanti people, it contains the soul of their entire nation, past, present, and future. No one sits on the Golden Stool, not even their own king. But one person in that room doesn't stay silent. A 60-year-old grandmother named Yaa Asantewaa rises to her feet. She's the Queen Mother of Ejisu, the sacred guardian of that very stool Hodgson demands. And she's about to make a declaration that will shake the British Empire to its core. Within weeks, this grandmother will command 12,000 warriors. She'll lay siege to a British fort with modern artillery. She'll design military tactics so effective that 1,000 British and Allied soldiers will die before it's over, more than all previous British Ashanti wars combined. But here's what makes this story absolutely extraordinary. This wasn't just any grandmother. This was the only woman in African history to serve as supreme military commander against a European colonial power. This was a 60-year-old farmer who grabbed a gun, fired it in front of an assembly of men, and declared, "If you won't fight for our king, then you should exchange your loincloths for my undergarments." What happened next became known as the War of the Golden Stool, the last great African resistance war of the colonial era, and it was led by a grandmother who refused to bow. If you want to discover how traditional rulers fought back against colonialism, if you want to understand what real resistance looks like, if you want to know the stories they don't teach in Western schools, you need to subscribe right now. Because the story of Yaa Asantewaa will change everything you think you know about African history. This is the epic tale of how one grandmother's refusal to surrender became the stuff of legend. To understand why Frederick Hodgson's demand ignited a war, you need to understand what the Golden Stool really means to the Ashanti people. Because this isn't just a symbol of power. This is something far more profound. Legend tells us that in the late 1600s, a high priest named Okomfo Anoki called down the Golden Stool from the heavens. It descended from the sky in clouds of thunder and smoke, landing at the feet of Ose Tutu, the first king of the Ashanti. But Anoki made something crystal clear. This stool contains the soul of the Ashanti nation. It must never touch the ground. No one must ever sit upon it. For over 200 years, the Ashanti followed this sacred law. Their kings were lowered over the stool during coronation ceremonies, but never actually touched it. The stool sat on its own throne, wrapped in sacred cloth, guarded by spiritual protectors. It was the difference between having a nation and being scattered tribes. This is what Frederick Hodgson, a postal clerk turned colonial administrator, didn't understand when he marched into Kumasi in March 1900. Hodgson embodied everything wrong with British colonialism. He wasn't a trained diplomat or cultural expert. He was a bureaucrat who'd worked his way up through the postal service and colonial offices, convinced that British superiority meant he could ignore local customs entirely. When he arrived in Kumasi on March 25, 1900, Hodgson was greeted with traditional honours. Ashanti children sang "God Save the Queen" to his wife. The chiefs accorded him the respect due to a foreign dignitary. They thought this was a diplomatic visit. They were wrong. On March 28th, Hodgson summoned the chiefs to an assembly. What he said next wasn't just diplomatically disastrous, it was spiritual warfare. "Your King Prempeh has been exiled and will never return to you," Hodgson announced. "His power and authority will be taken over by the British Queen and her representative. The terms of the 1874 peace treaty, which required you to pay for the cost of that war, have not been forgotten. The Ashanti are required to pay £160,000 a year, plus interest." The chiefs listened in growing anger. But then came the words that made war inevitable. "What must I do to the man, whoever he is, who has failed to give the Queen the stool to which she is entitled? Where is the Golden Stool? Why am I not sitting on the Golden Stool at this moment? I am the representative of the paramount power in this country. Why have you relegated me to this chair? Why did you not take the opportunity of my coming to Kumasi to bring the Golden Stool and give it to me to sit upon?" The silence that followed was deafening. Later, one British anthropologist would write, "A singularly foolish speech, an excellent example of the blunders that are made through ignorance of the African mind." But this wasn't just ignorance. This was calculated humiliation. Hodgson wanted to break the Ashanti spirit by forcing them to surrender their most sacred object. He believed, as he later told London, that if he could only get possession of the Golden Stool, he would be able to govern the country for all time. The chiefs returned to their homes in silence. But that silence wasn't surrender. It was preparation. Because sitting in that assembly was Yaa Asantewaa, the Queen Mother of Ejisu. And she was done being quiet. Yaa Asantewaa wasn't born to be a warrior. She was born in 1840 in Busayazi, a small farming community in the Ashanti heartland. Her father, Kwaku Ampoma, was a farmer. Her mother, Atapo, worked the land. Yaa Asantewaa grew up cultivating crops, learning traditional crafts, living what seemed like an ordinary life. But Yaa Asantewaa possessed something extraordinary, an unbreakable will. When her brother, Afrane Panin, became chief of Edweso, he appointed Yaa Asantewaa as Queen Mother, a position of immense responsibility. Queen Mothers in Ashanti society weren't ceremonial figures. They were the kingmakers, the advisors, the guardians of sacred traditions. Most importantly, they were the protectors of the Golden Stool. By 1900, Yaa Asantewaa had already endured decades of British aggression. She'd watched the British burn Kumasi in 1874. She'd seen them exile King Prempeh I to the Seychelles in 1896. When they exiled her own grandson, whom she'd appointed as chief, she became regent herself, ruling her district directly. Now, after Hodgson's outrageous demand, the remaining Ashanti leaders called a secret meeting. They gathered in the shadows, away from British spies, to discuss how to respond. Should they submit to this latest humiliation? Should they try to negotiate? Should they seek help from other African rulers? The men debated. They hesitated. They calculated the odds against them. And that's when Yaa Asantewaa stood up. What happened next has become one of the most famous speeches in African history. Different versions exist, but the core message burns through every telling. "Now I see that some of you fear to go forward to fight for our king. If you, the chiefs of Ashanti, are going to behave like cowards and not fight, you should exchange your loincloths for my undergarments." The insult was devastating. In Ashanti culture, suggesting that men should wear women's clothing was the ultimate challenge to their manhood. But Yaa Asantewaa wasn't finished. In the brave days of Ositutu, Okomfo Anokye, and Opoku-Ware, chiefs would not sit down to see their king taken away without firing a shot. No white man could have dared to speak to a chief of the Ashanti in the way the governor spoke to you this morning. Then came the declaration that changed everything. "If you won't fight, then I will. I will rally the women, and we will fight until the last of us falls in the battlefields." To punctuate her words, Yaa Asantewaa grabbed a rifle and fired it into the air. The effect was electric. The shame of being challenged by a grandmother broke through the men's hesitation. If a 60-year-old woman was ready to die for their king and their sacred stool, how could they remain passive? But here's what made this moment truly revolutionary. The chiefs didn't just agree to fight. They chose Yaa Asantewaa as their supreme military commander. This had never happened before in Ashanti history. No woman had ever led their armies. But these weren't normal times, and Yaa Asantewaa wasn't a normal woman. She immediately began mobilizing forces across the Ashanti territories. Villages that had been hesitant to challenge British power suddenly rallied to her call. Within days, she commanded an army of 5,000 warriors, with thousands more providing support. But Yaa Asantewaa knew that enthusiasm wouldn't be enough. The British had modern weapons, trained soldiers, and artillery. She needed strategy. What she devised was a masterpiece of asymmetric warfare. While Yaa Asantewaa mobilized her forces, Frederick Hodgson made a catastrophic mistake. Instead of waiting for reinforcements, he sent Captain Cecil Armitage with a detachment to search for the Golden Stool in the forests around Kumasi. This wasn't diplomacy. This was cultural rape. Ashanti warriors ambushed Armitage's search party, and only a sudden rainstorm allowed the survivors to retreat to the British administrative compound in Kumasi. Hodgson found himself trapped with 18 Europeans, dozens of mixed-race colonial administrators, and 500 Nigerian Hausa soldiers who served as colonial troops. The compound they fortified became known as Kumasi Fort, a 50-yard square stockade with 12-foot high stone walls, loopholes for rifles, and firing turrets at each corner. They had 6 small field guns and 4 Maxim machine guns. By colonial standards, it was well defended, but they had no idea what Yaa Asantewaa was planning. On March 30th, 2 days after Hodgson's speech, the war officially began when 12,000 Ashanti warriors surrounded Kumasi Fort. But this wasn't a mindless assault. Yaa Asantewaa had studied British tactics from previous wars, and she understood their weaknesses. The British expected frontal attacks they could mow down with machine guns. Instead, Yaa Asantewaa ordered her forces to dig in for a siege. Her warriors constructed 21 massive log barricades across every road leading to Kumasi. These weren't simple obstacles. They were engineering marvels. 6 feet high, hundreds of yards long, built from logs, stones, and earth so densely packed that British artillery couldn't break them. Each barricade had loopholes for snipers and flanking positions that made them nearly impossible to storm. The psychological warfare was equally sophisticated. Yaa Asantewaa's forces cut the telegraph wires, isolating the fort from the outside world. They controlled all food supplies, slowly starving the defenders. They launched night attacks that kept the British constantly on edge. Most importantly, they blocked every escape route. The British were trapped 200 miles from the coast, surrounded by hostile territory, with no way to call for help. Inside the fort, conditions rapidly deteriorated. The British had stockpiled food for maybe 2 weeks. They were cramming nearly 600 people into a space designed for 100. Disease began spreading. The wounded couldn't be properly treated. The smell of unwashed bodies and inadequate sanitation made life miserable. Outside, Yaa Asantewaa commanded her forces with tactical brilliance. She rotated fresh troops to keep the pressure constant. She positioned snipers to pick off anyone who showed themselves. She used drums and war cries to create psychological pressure. The siege lasted for months. The British, supposedly the masters of military technology, were being systematically destroyed by a 60-year-old grandmother using traditional African warfare tactics. But Yaa Asantewaa's greatest victory wasn't military, it was symbolic. Every day, the siege continued proved that Africans could resist European colonialism. Word spread across the continent. The Ashanti were fighting back, and they were winning. By June 1900, the situation inside Kumasi Fort had become desperate. Food supplies were nearly exhausted. Disease had killed dozens of defenders. The British were down to their last ammunition reserves. That's when Frederick Hodgson made another fateful decision. He would abandon the fort and try to fight his way to the coast. On June 23rd, under cover of pre-dawn darkness, Hodgson led a breakout attempt. He took the healthiest men, including his wife, Lady Mary Alice Hodgson, the first British woman to visit Ashanti territory, and over 100 Hausa soldiers. What followed was one of the most harrowing chases in colonial military history. Yaa Asantewaa had anticipated this move. The moment the escape party left the fort, she unleashed 12,000 warriors in pursuit. The British had to fight running battles across 200 miles of hostile territory, through dense forest, across rivers, over mountains, with Ashanti forces constantly attacking their flanks. The British called this a fighting retreat. The Ashanti called it target practice. Dozens of Hodgson's men died during the escape. Others collapsed from exhaustion and disease. The survivors reached the coast, looking like refugees from hell, starved, wounded, traumatized by their ordeal. But Hodgson's escape created a new crisis. He'd left behind 100 men to hold Kumasi Fort, including Captain Bishop, Mr. Ralph, and Dr. Hay. These defenders had maybe 3 weeks of food left, and now they faced the full fury of Yaa Asantewaa's forces. Meanwhile, news of the Ashanti uprising had finally reached London. The British government was horrified. A colonial rebellion that had trapped a governor and destroyed entire military units was an existential threat to the empire. If the Ashanti could successfully resist, what would stop other colonies from following their example? The British response was overwhelming force. Lieutenant Colonel James Wilcox was ordered to assemble a relief army from British forces across West Africa. Nigerian troops, Gold Coast Constabulary, Indian units, and British regulars were rushed to the coast. By early July, Wilcox commanded over 1,400 soldiers with modern artillery and unlimited ammunition. But getting to Kumasi would require fighting through Yaa Asantewaa's defensive lines. The relief expedition became a brutal slugging match. Wilcox's forces had to storm each of those 21 log barricades Yaa Asantewaa had constructed. Each barricade cost them dozens of casualties. The Ashanti defenders, fighting on their home ground with intimate knowledge of the terrain, made every mile cost blood. At Kokofu, one of the major barricades, the British suffered their heaviest casualties of the entire war. Yaa Asantewaa's warriors had turned the village into a fortress, with overlapping fields of fire and underground tunnels that allowed defenders to appear and disappear like ghosts. The fighting was so intense that Wilcox later wrote, "The enemy were both brave and cunning, fighting behind concealed stockades with a skill that would have done credit to European engineers." But British firepower eventually told. On July 14th, after weeks of bloody fighting, Wilcox's forces finally reached the outskirts of Kumasi. On July 15th, they broke through to the fort, just 2 days before the defenders would have run out of food entirely. The siege was broken, but the war was far from over. The relief of Kumasi Fort marked the beginning of the end for Yaa Asantewaa's resistance, but she wasn't finished fighting. Even with British reinforcements pouring into Ashanti territory, Yaa Asantewaa continued launching guerrilla attacks. Her forces had been scattered by the British assault, but they hadn't been destroyed. Small groups of warriors continued ambushing British patrols, attacking supply lines, and making colonial rule impossible. For months, the British found themselves fighting what they called flying columns, mobile Ashanti units that struck without warning and disappeared into the forest. Every village might contain hidden weapons. Every path might lead to an ambush. Every peaceful farmer might be a resistance fighter. The British response was predictably brutal. They launched what they euphemistically called pacification campaigns, military expeditions that burned villages, confiscated land, and killed anyone suspected of supporting Yaa Asantewaa. The casualty figures from this final phase of the war are staggering. British records admit to losing over 1,000 soldiers and colonial troops, more than any previous conflict in West Africa. But Ashanti casualties were far higher. Modern historians estimate that 2,000 Ashanti warriors died in battle, with thousands more civilians killed during the British reprisals. These numbers represented the highest death toll from any Anglo-Ashanti war, higher than all previous conflicts combined. But the most remarkable thing about this final phase wasn't the casualties. It was what the British couldn't capture. Despite months of searching, despite torturing prisoners, despite offering massive rewards, the British never found the Golden Stool. The Ashanti had successfully hidden their most sacred object in the forests, where it would remain safe until 1920. And even then, it was discovered by accident by road workers, not British searchers. Yaa Asantewaa had won her most important victory. The soul of the Ashanti nation remained free. In September 1900, Yaa Asantewaa was finally captured along with 15 of her closest advisors. The British immediately exiled them to the Seychelles Islands, as far from Africa as they could manage. The parallels were deliberate. King Prempeh I had been exiled to the same islands in 1896. The British wanted to ensure that no Ashanti leaders could return to inspire further resistance. But even in defeat, Yaa Asantewaa had achieved something extraordinary. She'd proven that Africans could fight European colonialism on equal terms. She demonstrated that traditional leaders could adapt ancient military tactics to modern warfare. Most importantly, she'd shown that resistance was possible. Yaa Asantewaa died in exile on October 17, 1921. She never saw her homeland again. She was 81 years old, and she'd spent the last 21 years of her life as a prisoner of the British Empire. But her story didn't end with her death. In 1924, 3 years after Yaa Asantewaa died, the British finally allowed King Prempehwis to return to Ashanti. One of his first acts was to give Yaa Asantewaa a proper royal funeral, honouring her as a queen and a warrior. In 1957, when Ghana became the first African nation south of the Sahara to gain independence, Yaa Asantewaa's resistance was celebrated as the foundation of the independence movement. Her refusal to surrender had inspired generations of African leaders. Today, Yaa Asantewaa is remembered as more than just a military leader. She's a symbol of what's possible when people refuse to accept oppression. Schools, hospitals, and universities across Ghana bear her name. Her story is taught to children as proof that their ancestors were heroes, not victims. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to Yaa Asantewaa is this: the Golden Stool still exists. It still belongs to the Ashanti people. It has never been touched by foreign hands. The 60-year-old grandmother who declared war on the British Empire didn't just fight for her king or her people. She fought for the principle that some things are too sacred to surrender, no matter what the cost. In an age when we're told that resistance is futile, when we're told to accept injustice quietly, when we're told that ordinary people can't change history, remember Yaa Asantewaa. Remember that sometimes it takes a grandmother to teach the world what courage really means. If this story inspired you, if you want to learn more about African leaders who refuse to bow to colonialism, if you believe these stories deserve to be told, subscribe now and join the community that's reclaiming African history from the colonizers who tried to erase it. Because Yaa Asantewaa's war isn't over. It continues every time we tell her story. It continues every time we refuse to accept the official version of history. It continues every time we remember that resistance is always possible. The grandmother warrior lives on.